Hello everyone, today a brief reflection on some aspect of the Augustan military reform and administration. We're no stranger to the Augustan period also as far as the formalization of a fully permanent army, the establishment of guard units in Rome. There's a lot to dig into that. Today we observe specifically the regularization of the senatorial and the equestrian path to the cursus honorum in the military. Also, the different regulation of Egypt, that is a notorious topic. We also made a video about the province of Egypt and its very peculiar condition and government that we will discuss today, especially at the end. So it's almost unnecessary to state that the Augustan military organization reflected the new social system of the empire, particularly in the dynamics between the troops and their officers. Typically, in fact, only those of the senatorial order, specifically individuals who through either agnatic, that means patrilinear, or adoptive, descended, still patrilinear anyway, were sons, grandsons, or great-grandsons of a senator, or who received the latus clavis from the emperor himself, would command a legion. Speaking of the latus clavis, make some digression in this video. The Romans referred to the strips that adorn clothing, blankets, and similar items as clavi. In the case of tunics, the arrangement, width, and color of these strips could vary. The tunic embellished with wide purple stripes was a special privilege reserved for certain categories of citizens, specifically the senators and the knights. Traditionally, the origin of this distinguishing feature traces back, apparently at least, to the Etruscans. According to Pliny, Natural History 9:136, it's possible that in earlier times it served as a mark of nobility. However, it was only in the 1st century BC that a distinction was established, with the formalization of the same Augustan era, granting senators a tunic with wide purple stripes, which is the latus clavis. All right, clavus stems also from nail, because these pieces of cloth were originally fixed with a brooch on the other clothes, and knights instead would retain a tunic with narrower stripes, so the angustus clavis, and that's the distinction we will see now in the Augustan military career. Although the wide striped tunic was exclusive to senators, the narrow striped version could be worn by others, albeit likely as an undesirable imitation of status, as we will see now. The width of stripes, which were woven into the fabric and seemingly ran along its edges, was relative, as there was no fixed standard governing this aspect, at least originally. Over time, especially from, in fact, the reign of Augustus, the use of the laticlavis was extended to all members of senatorial families. In parallel with such military reform, young men would don it along with a toga virilis upon reaching adulthood, hence the term juvenis laticlavius, thus making the granting of the laticlavis a symbol and synonym for inclusion in the senatorial order. It remains unclear whether the decurions of municipalities and colonies had the right to wear a laticlavis. There is a passage from Horace, from the Satires 1:534, that suggests that their wearing it could be perceived as a comical display of dignity. In other words, they had some status and authority, but they were just trying to imitate the higher levels. The laticlavis tunic was typically worn without a belt. During periods of public mourning, it would be removed or exchange for tunic with narrower stripes. Augustus would retain such senatorial order in charge of legionary command, except, as we will see, for some very specific cases, this contrast that, as we will also understand better now, had to do with the other element that could inspire to that was the equestrian order, would in fact regulate matters differently up to, for example, Septimius Severus. Then the same Augustan system came in the 3rd century to an end. This is not much the point. But of course, and I remember the video in which I discussed this about the balance between this still conservative but also part more liberal policy played on by Augustus, respectively on the senators and on the knights. It was still overall a very traditional way of being both conservative and liberal. Is basically the balance, in many ways also the military genius of Augustus, among the other things, right? This was also functional to a much broader balance that we will talk about in some theological video, or rather. So how would the service go? Well, following their service as vigintiviri, these senators would assume the role of tribune with a latus clavus and advance through a standard senatorial career, which included positions like the quaestor, the tribunus, the aedile, the praetor, and so on, ultimately leading to the command of a legion. Now, a brief word for the vigintiviri, because we talked about the chain of command of the early Imperial Roman army, but let's refresh this a bit. That these figures had been, especially up to Augustus, that now sort of regulated the thing further. So in ancient Rome, it was a college consisting of 20 members, hence vigintiviri, specifically a group of lower magistracies that individuals aspiring to the quaestorship and subsequently to a political career were required to hold, to see if they were good at anything. During the late so-called Republican period, there were 26 members, known in fact as the vigintisex viri, which included the tres viri capitales, the tres viri monetales. The latter are also the ones that we've seen in the coin gift videos, are very much connected with also the iconography that you can find on the coins. The decem viri litibus judicandis, the quattuor viri vis in urbe purgandis, the duo viri vis extra urbem purgandis, and the 4 prefects of Capua and Cumae. So Augustus essentially abolished the last 2 colleges. They were essentially not much needed anymore for both for the let's say the condition of Italy and the specific cities in relation with Rome, and also the general administration of the Rome, the surrounding of Rome had somehow improved scale. It's at this point that the vigintisex viri became known as the vigintiviri, because 6 of them were removed. Now, speaking of the latus clavus tribunate, this aspect is important as far as the command of the legions as well, because following the Marian reform of the Roman army, the tribune Laticlavius had held the second highest rank of the legion, subordinate to the legatus legionis, so the legion commander, and superior to the other 5 tribuni angusti clavi, so traditionally from the equestrian order, as we will see now better, and later the praefectus castrorum. This position could only be held by individuals from senatorial families as well, and it was not mandatory to occupy it in order to complete the cursus honorum. Suetonius recounts that Augustus allowed the sons of senators to help them learn more quickly how to manage the affairs of the res publica, to wear the laticlavus shortly after donning the toga virilis, as we've seen, and to attend sessions of the Senate. For those who later pursued a military career, he provided the opportunity to join the legions as tribuni laticlavi, or to serve in auxiliary troops as prefect, the ally. We will see later. Recognizing the importance of military experience, Augustus typically assigned 2 laticlavius officers to command each cavalry unit, even though also the knights. Then you have the ex-praetors, the praetori, understood as such, as those who had covered that had covered in the past the office, being appointed as legati Augusti pro praetore for imperial provinces with a single legion, while the ex-consuls, the consulares, were selected for provinces with multiple legions, because they were expected to be more militarily capable. Now, the position of legatus Augusti pro praetore was established by Augustus in 27 BC, during the reform of the provincial administration that he imposed on the Senate following his victory in the civil wars. To secure control over the military, Augustus insisted on retaining the imperium over provinces that were not pacified, namely frontier provinces and newly acquired territories where the legions were stationed. I made a video on this topic, of course, the senatorial and imperial provinces. The emperor fundamentally controlled more directly, of course, the more strategically relevant places. Of course, this idea was not entirely new. Pompey, for example, upon obtaining imperium over further Spain in 58 BC, opted to remain in Rome for political reasons and delegated the administration of the province to his legates. That's when the things started to be generalized. And this decision undoubtedly served as a precedent for Octavian. The title of legatus Augusti pro praetore indicates that these governors were legates to whom Augustus had delegated his imperium. Remember this when you read the Res Gestae, read when he talked about auspicis meis, and understanding what that means as a medium of God to veiculate the Holy Ghost, the imperium. The imperium in the provinces to which, of course, they were assigned by himself, and they held the position of pro praetor, which, as noted by Cassius Dio, had a strong military connotation since the early days of the so-called Republican era. Indeed, during their tenure, they were required to wear military attire and carry a sword, because that's how the imperium was manifested. They could be of consular rank, former consuls, or of praetorian rank, depending on the number of legions stationed in their assigned province. If only one legion was present, they directly commanded that legion. Conversely, if multiple legions were stationed in their territory, the legatus Augusti pro praetore commanded a legatus legionis for each legion. Like the procurator Augusti and the praefectus Alexandria, we'll see now, at Egypt, both with equestrian rank, the legatus Augusti pro praetore was directly appointed by the emperor and served without a fixed term, because they were on behalf, right? And so the procedure of renovation could be bypassed. They wielded full authority in civil, military, and judicial matters, but unlike equestrian governors, did not have control over provincial finances, for example, or manage the payment of the army under their command. These responsibilities fell entirely to the procurator Augusti. This was also wise because there was a division between the military force. Of course, this was a commander that took matters in his own hands there, but at least the civil administration, the provisional resources fell on another individual. Similarly, proconsuls for senatorial provinces, so not the ones managed by the emperor, came from both ex-consuls and ex-praetors. Just had different powers, different administrative forms. At some point we will probably make videos explaining in depth like what happened in each of these. Now in most cases, however, command of the garrison in a proconsular province was assigned to the various legati pro praetore under the proconsul. Speaking of the equestrian ordering instead, we're talking about typically individuals with a wealth of 400,000 sesterces, that would be roughly today's $1 million, and recognition, that is probatio, in the emperor's own compiled list of knights, aspired to become prefects of a cohort and then advanced to the tribunate with the Augustan, and the prefecture of an ala, a wing, cavalry wing, which also opened up significant administrative roles, such as the procurators for them. Very interesting here is the role of the equites, of the knights, that is actually always underrated when we think about ancient Rome. I recently made a video about Roman cavalry to stress how important mounted forces actually were for Rome, and especially how good and highly qualitative Roman cavalry really was. And the equites in this sense are not simply an order abstract from, that military and imperial function in a theological sense. We tend to hear very much thrown around the term class per se. We have to understand that these were proper estates. There is something very similar actually to the Roman orders system, and the one that could be, for example, from a medieval city-state. The ratios of strength were a bit unbalanced, but there was also, in fact, an empire there. It's something different, considering those who ruled this empire that had actually grown in this enormous wealth, these privileged orders, because they had been the ones who had exemplified that province, also from a military point of view, that still was the key to it. Now, the interesting thing is that in Augustus' times, as we just said, the emperor would compile by himself the list of the knights. This is incredibly important because it shows you how sort of almost individualistically and feudally and ad personam in this sense the recognition of knights really was. We've seen before that you could be a senator, of course, only, say, in the natural way through a patrilineal line, so either biological or adopted. And considering how we will see what adoption worked like at the time, that was understood metaphysically as a real fatherhood, because essentially even at a biological level, because they provided with this transfiguring change in the adopted background. The soul dominated the same flesh, of course, but we will talk about this now. But and that, however, the emperor could appoint senators individually by conferring them the latus clause. Here it's basically the same. The emperor can actually appoint specific knights that will have elevated themselves as such, and that aspirationally, just given their social background, would have in fact undertook a military career, which was quite advantageous if you understand here, in fact, all the offices that open to. We've seen also in a video about the quality of Roman leadership, a very actually Clausewitzian mentality concerning the fact that military offices had to be covered early in age, so to prove whether you were good for sort of a higher form of command, and so passing to a more strictly political career that still entailed, of course, the like we've seen here with the consuls, the praetors, an imperium, but that was also in fact something looking from the above, and so being able to understand also bigger strategic issues. But the idea of the involvement, and preparing a video regarding the gladiatura, in violence, in championship, in duels, and so on, in knowing how to lead these units, like the ally, for example, the cohorts, is key to determine who the knights had to be. Right? These were literally the equestrians who elevated themselves as griffins between heaven and earth. The senators instead were already in the realm of the Father, right? As heavenly rulers, the knights were the ones who were essentially entering. Right now, there is a very Apollonian mentality in this regard. We also here notice of course, the tribunate with the Angusticlave that, in fact, distinguished the knights from the senators. The Angusticlave tribune in the Roman military was a member of the command group comprising the 5 tribunes of the Roman legion. 1 Roman legion. The title Angusticlave, of course, refers, as we said at the beginning, to the purple stripe sewn on the toga, which signifies the older's membership to the Equestrian order. And those who held this position often had prior experience as commanders of an auxiliary cohort before transitioning to the legion. So that was also a hell of a job, because the auxiliaries were often used in more dangerous ways than the Roman legions were, and they were also, in this sense, more prone to be wiped out, actually. So being a commander from that experience was pretty intense. And some sources describe this Angusticlave tribunes of equestrian background as cadet officers. Right, it's very fitting to the role, to the figure they still have today. So as these individuals, again, of equestrian rank with military experience, but lacking actual authority still, and so that's why this were to enter further into the higher administrative roles and careers. Other very important thing to bear in mind is that in the Augustan system, each of these 2 social orders, the senators and the knights, held distinct priestly positions. Because, of course, the imperium entailed such power, but the military connection especially rendered them truly more connected theologically. The knights, as you know, participated famously to the imperial funeral by throwing their own medals onto the imperial pyre burning, because their rewards were seen as a fruit of heaven mediated by the emperor. So this belonged to the merit of the supreme ruler of the human empire that at that point was also transfiguring and rising to heaven. We'll talk more about the Decursi, and they literally rode on horseback around the pyre. That's how much of an equestrian culture Rome actually was, in pure knighthood. In fact, the knights, especially the ones exorned by a public horse, that was a specific, say, office. And there were a few, but within the knights, but it still was there, represented in this sense an exception to the concept we're always being told, like of the apparently, allegedly, perfectly republican system, where the citizen soldier had to provide for his own equipment or there was a condition of parity in the social balance, even when the state was starting to pay for that, which actually is much earlier than the same Marian reforms. That, however, in fact, maintained that sense of equality. Like even in Augustan times, like the legionaries had to eventually give back their equipment when they were, in fact, discharged, in order to pay when these were damaged. Naturally, things were a bit more complicated than this. They would actually receive a salary, and that was part of their service as well. But still, these means were thought to be ideally connected with that real, also sort of primitive way of organizing war. The knights had this exception for which the state paid them the horse, which is again disproving what we were saying before regarding the idea you have to provide just for your own equipment. No, there is a degree of a higher level of superiority, a bit like in the Middle Ages. It was the same identical thing. Look at the rest hour in the communes, for example. Essentially, the knights were in charge, and that system were paid by the community, maintained, because their war horses were so expensive that in order just to have them, right, it was much more convenient just to entrust them to these knights, and to pay for such specialized professionals of war to manage pretty much everything. In Rome, you have something similar, because these guys are not the ones that had simply to provide their own means, that they eventually did use in order to pursue their careers, that would be rewarded for their superiority, for this sense that they were contributing militarily to the elevating the superiority of the system. The senators had already gotten there. They were more, they were expected simply by stock to be like that. The knights were the ones who were proving themselves, and that's why also the religious offices were so relevant for these orders. Now, as illustrated, the Roman state that emerged from the transformations initiated by Caesar and Augustus relied on the privileges of these two upper orders: the senatorial one, which held the superior dignity, and the equestrian one, the equestrian order, which enjoyed close ties to the emperor as well. There is properly the list that Augustus draws, because he is, as an emperor, as a leader of men, the one that spots the knights that are actually worth of that order. And so there is, as we said before, also in the few imperial funerals, etc., deep personal connection to him. This is extremely relevant because, of course, the emperor was himself a senator by extraction, by origin, especially at this point, because Augustus is de facto primus inter pares among the senators, the princeps, very, again, almost Germanic Tacitian concept. Well, of course, they stem exactly from the same Indo-European essence of this order that we described as such in multiple videos. And that thus was to recognize these individuals of the big imperial Roman retinue. Consider the ordo as this, right? Not as the civilian, not just civil or civilized, but the civilian sort of idea of there is an order, there is a class, it's about money, it's socio-economical. It is military, it's political, it's religious, it's this pure sense of metaphysics that permeated this individual's soul. Augustus had a massive statue of Phoebus Apollo connected to his house, just to give an idea of that. Didn't talk too much about the Hyperborean symbology, etc., but you know what that means. And especially in this time and age, the Golden Era prophesies that coming back temporally between the Bronze and the Iron One, it's exactly the reign of Augustus. The interplay between the two orders the expression was uterque ordo, that is to say, the in English you would say both orders, plural. Here it's basically the single order, but with two in one, right, in Latin, and formed, and that tells you like the corporatistic traditional meaning of the entire empire, by the way, formed in fact the foundation of the Augustan Principate itself, blending the traditional authority of the senatorial order with this more challenging and rejuvenating spirit of the equestrian one. The equestrians were the ones who would, as we'll see now, be challenging the senatorial order. It's always like this in traditional society. The balance is never static. It's always about the struggle between the system, but conferring strength to the same, compaction to the same, because it's within the frame of this divine hierarchy in order that counterbalance one another. And this point works like hell, right? Very well. And so this it would be, you can interpret also the decline of the Roman Empire in the fractures in this balance that in fact would later account for changes in legislation regarding the election of magistrates, and significantly influencing in fact the evolution of the Principate towards something more monarchic. And so on the longer run, sclerotic, even though the Augustan system literally lasted until Diocletian. Despite the fact of the 3rd century crisis in fact brought to the main change, and with Constantine it's something even more different. It's, again, a big deal. Things change. It's not like those people were evil or bad. It's just the world had degenerated in the meanwhile. All right, and Rome had maintained her centrality in spite of the fact that those who had made her were in fact degrading themselves, and the rest of the world with it. With them, there is no God by definition in any metaphysical dimension outside of Rome. But humans are humans. Humans belong, we've seen the doctrine of the two natures, who are constantly degenerating reality. Rome is the only light of God that exists in the universe since ever. And we'll talk more about this also properly in an astronomical sense. The centrality of Rome in the globe and in the universe, it's crucial. It's something incredibly overlooked. Nobody researches. I will be providing you with something very interesting, hopefully soon. In any case, this dynamics that we're saying, especially become apparent in times of crisis when the emperor increasingly aligned himself with the equestrian order in opposition to the senatorial one. A notable example from the 1st century AD is the severe crisis during Nero's reign. Nero was actually a hell of a ruler in many ways, but also we never made a video about him, so I can't fully explain you how that was the case. In any case, initially close to the senatorial elite, you know how it went, right? Nero ultimately soured his relations with the Senate and threatened to govern solely through the equestrian order and freedmen, the latter aspect not being really, latter element, I would say better, not really flattering in that sense, but that was a problem of the senators as well, because where were they? And in fact, marginalizing, especially the latter, the senators, by proposing to entrust provinces and military command to Roman equestrians, but also freedmen, which starts being a bit of a theological issue with the freedmen. But also the fatherly order there is challenged. The expression in the source that refers to the latter dynamic of entrusting the provinces, and that's why it was se provincias et exercitus equiti Romano ac libertis permissurum. Right, so literally the In fact, the equestrians and the freedmen were allowed, were permitted to rule the provinces and the army. Contrasts also emerged within the harmony that Augustus sought to establish, and that he was, however, an incredibly refined and sophisticated master of, such as his decision to deny senators control over certain provinces. We've seen it. We will make many other videos showing how Augustus' hallmark of political genius was balance. They do not really make him just the greatest political genius in history, but also one that was maintaining the equilibrium of the order through his own character, through his own nature. They were very, very much oriented in that direction, and for so many reasons that are also historical, have to do with Caesar's legacy and more. And Caesar was a different type of ruler, for example, and even just a different type of man. In any case, at this very high levels, they matched very much in the succession. But this choice, like of denying senators control over certain provinces, is immediate in Augustan history. Everybody knows it, and it's particularly evident in the organization of legions. First of all, were a praefectus legionis instead of a legatus legionis. So an equestrian commander rather than a senatorial commander, the latter would have been standard for imperial provinces, took command, right? This aspect is crucial because the title prefectus legionis was assigned to the commanders of a legion in ancient Rome. Hence, this role was granted now to members of the Equestrian order and applied only to the provinces of Egypt and later, as we will see, Mesopotamia. But it's not in Augustan times. Now, the Praefectus Legionis, originally identified with the Praefectus Castrorum, acted as the deputy of the Legatus Legionis and typically ranged in the age from 25 to 35 years. So he was actually a subordinate to the Legatus. Augustus changes it in this specific case of Egypt. His responsibilities included issuing orders to tribunes, centurions, and soldiers, maintaining discipline within the ranks, because in the rest of the provinces that remain the same, managing the supplies and rations of the troops. I mean, very important functions, but this tells you also what kind of hell of a military cursus there was. We've seen it in the video about the chain of command of the early Imperial Roman Legion. Like all these mentions entailed. Now, the role of the praefectus was also, and thus, vital in ensuring the legion's efficiency, and according to the historian Vegetius, he was expected to be just and skilled in command. Later, under Gallienus, we mentioned briefly later, the Legatus Legionis position held by senators was replaced by the Praefecti Legionis commanding within the Roman army. And so this is the completion of what Augustus had begun, as we'll see now with Egypt during his reign, right? It takes centuries, evidently. And this deployment marked, it would be fully, I think, this deployment marked the end of the connection also between the legions and Italy. We talked about Gallienus' army, by the way, so we can check that out for the broader meaning of the functionality of this change. As we were in the 3rd century, new commanders emerged from military careers focused more on provincial interests. Consequently, this is the point in this early centuries of the empire. Prefectus Legionis became the most significant officer within the legion, while senatorial roles such as a tribune and legatus were gradually phased out. With Augustus, we're just at the beginning of this dynamic. It wasn't properly even imagined by him, like that was just something that reflected the political and social balance of the time. The career progression for equestrians, including the possibility of attaining prestigious positions, as we were saying before, such as the prefectus praetorio after serving as prefectus legionis. And the second aspect, in fact, was this, that in a similar way, the overall military command in Egypt was held by the prefectus Alexandriae et Aegypti. This was the main change, right? And where these two provisions overlap. Right? The governor of Egypt was entrusted to a prefect of equestrian rank. This is perhaps one of the single most important aspects of the Augustan administration. We illustrated this in the video about the Roman province of Egypt. I think I shall resume making videos about the various Roman provinces to explain how they work. Egypt, as you know, holding a massive relevance as far as properly the imperial concept of Rome. Like the Romans had penetrated this southern feminine country with provided with enormous agricultural resources and plenty of riches, etc. As the northern conquerors coming on their Liburni, as the, again, in fact, the Hyperborean Apollo from the north, remolding the world at their own image. Egypt was perhaps the most prestigious of the Catholic countries, traditionally, historically, right? The power of the pharaohs still was connected well in awareness to that original divine rule, and Alexander was buried there, and Augustus notoriously believed when he visited Egypt after knocking out his rivals Antony and Cleopatra, visiting Alexander's tomb, stated, because he had been told by some of his people were accompanying him, but do you want to go see also the tomb of Ptolemy? So the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty, was a famous general of the same Alexander. And as you know, Augustus, the same, that was a connection with the same, adopted connection with St. Cleopatra's family there, because those weren't dangers she was, and also Caesarea for that matter, but it's another story. And he famously answered, no, because I haven't come here to visit corpses, entailing that Alexander was still alive. Of course. That's how they conceived power at the time. You're permanently alive. Caesar is alive. There's a comet there that is him. The firmament constantly reintervenes in the life of men. The same mortal spoils are containing that power. And Egypt was so crucial in a strategical sense, exactly because of supplying the empire with grain, having this broader resonance as far as also the Hellenistic haste is concerned, adding prestige to the same Augustus that again in Rome was essentially, in theory at least, a citizen like all others, a Roman like all others. I mean, at least in a political, juridical sense, then of course he was much greater than the others, and far beyond an individual, and in fact human greatness himself. And he would have never allowed anyone, for example, even, at least a Roman, kneeling in front of him, a freeman. That was completely impossible. Like the Romans, the Romano-Italic citizenry had completely self-awareness of their cohesion, their compactness. They were the chosen people of God that had conquered the entire world. This was impossible. But of course Augustus would allow the Egyptians to represent him as a pharaoh, because they were an inferior people that were subjugated by Rome and other peoples before them. And so that sort of autocratic strike there was particularly functional to the same local political needs of controlling this territory. that had to be, in fact, provided with this prefect of Egypt, and illustrating, of course, Augustus' skepticism towards the senatorial order, at least to the extent that he knew, having coming out from having put an end to the civil wars, knew pretty well. So the title prefect of Egypt, so officially known as we've seen as Praefectus Alexandriae et Aegypti, which distinguished, of course, the Alexandrine center and legacy, and in fact, the tomb of Alexander, from the rest of Egypt. Said it was incredibly important to recognize the Macedonian legacy there, also in the wake of which, as well as throughout all the entire East, Rome was proceeding, as of course Surpassinarian, was assigned to the governor of, because that's what he did, he was a Roman province of Egypt, starting in 30 BC, when Augustus appointed Gaius Cornelius Gallus to this position. Famous figure, we'll talk about him in some other video. This is just after 2 years that Egypt had fallen, like into Octavian's hands. Of equestrian rank, the prefect was directly chosen by the emperor, to whom he was solely accountable. This exclusivity in the imperial control of this province in particular was really crucial. There was a connection there with Alexander, couldn't even be remotely touched, together with the entire political and strategic balance of the empire. That's how powerful, in a metaphysical sense, Augustus was. There was another space that he could only play in, right? That he inherited from Caesar, that had come out of the res publica to fix it, right, through Fortuna. Now, given the wealth and significance of Egypt, it was considered one of the most important, yet potentially destabilizing, in fact, provinces of the empire. Consequently, the role was entrusted to this trusted official of the prince, who was outside the senatorial aristocracy. In fact, senators were even forbidden from visiting the province, and had reduced also rank and authority himself. Like, one of the reasons why the prefect was a knight is that, of course, the equestrian order was extremely dependent on the emperor, as we've seen, because there were the senators in between that were also trying to keep the knights down. So there was a very specific political motivation that would ensure such trust towards the emperor. The prefect was typically assisted by an ideologos. This is interesting. Ideologos is, from the Hellenic, of course, idios, logos, meaning private accountant to some degree. This was, interestingly, a role inherited from the Ptolemaic monarchy. Of course, there was a continuity part with local administration. There was no need to change it. Right? The Romans were simply lording over these lands in a feudal guise. This ideologos was responsible for imperial assets and the collection of extraordinary revenues, such as fines and taxes, maintaining an idea of apparent continuity with the prior regime, because that's what essentially the Greeks believed, that Rome was, yes, hegemonic and ruling, but it's as if, the Greeks were still within their own bubble. So yes, they could have been subjected, but in their minds, as if nothing had changed. Of course, they realized how much had changed. But that was the typically Hellenic thinking, almost an isolationistic one, that would never accept, of course, that the perfection of the Hellenic world could ever be molded by anything, if anything. They were at the center, and the rest was outside. Now, the prefect's term was not limited in duration, as we observed for these figures, and included, as the legati, and included the imperium militiae, or command over local troops, which initially encompassed 3 legions, and later, from the era of Hadrian, 1. which is, a balanced number, right? Egypt is pretty stretched towards the south. In Augustus' times, there are also problems there. We'll talk about Candace, the Ethiopians, and so on. In any case, these legions were stationed in mostly a peaceful land, except there were lots of people. Qualitatively speaking, they weren't particularly dangerous in a military sense, but the legions had to be stationed there and left as a possible reserve. If anything happened in the east that was a bit more troubled, there was a scarce, again, threat from any kind of nomadic reality at the time, both in Africa and in the neighboring Arabia. In any case, the legal foundation, that's also why Hadrian shifted that to other places. And the legal foundation of the Egyptian prefecture was a legislative act promoted by Octavian upon his return to Rome following his victory over Mark Antony. We are in 30 or 29 BC. We're not sure because we don't have the precise date in any case. This law established Octavian's authority over the province, with the prefect's imperium being a direct derivation of it. And the powers of the prefect were based on the so-called similitudo proconsulis. In other words, there was an analogy to the Republican proconsul drawn here. While it guaranteed him the same powers, it did not make him a magistrate, but rather a representative of the emperor in that capacity. We pointed out before. They were acting on behalf of some higher power, an extension of it, without official charges in that regard. The prefect did not possess, in fact, an imperium of his own either. I mean, he has as a knight headed, but as far as the administration of Egypt, unlike for other provinces with consuls, proconsuls, praetors, propraetors, and even smaller magistracies, mostly with civilian functions, but still did have different parts of imperium. He had, yes, of course, the faculty of commanding the local legions, but not for an imperium that he detained, but one that was granted as an extension by the emperor. Remember the list of knights drawn by the same emperor. Remember the decursio. These equites were connected to imperial power as, again, Romulus, Celeres, right, back in the day. They were a manifestation, had devoted themselves as knights to that cultic initiatory military condition that made them serving so imperial power in becoming. We talked about this, the Sol Invictus. It was surely also very much connected with, in fact, the Egyptian symbolism that at least was shared, like among all these peoples, regarding properly the becoming. The fact that, as the phrase says, like the sacred ruler is far, both from men and gods at the same time. In Egypt, seemed exactly this land. Seemed exactly the place where this could manifest, where only Augustus had, in virtue of his Sebastos status, that was also very much, but Latin and Greek in that sense shared the Indo-European root. In Latin it's augere, which means to increase, right? This idea of somebody who was actually superior by status and quasi-divine, manifesting divinity, through in fact the dispensation of this imperium, because that was true for Octavian when he became Augustus, and even before, to a degree, of course, in the way as a princeps. The princeps of the Senate. So remember again the rivalry existing between the knighthood and the senators that were sandwiched between the emperor and, in fact, and the Equestrian order. Egypt is the place in which such distance could be found. And this connection was so mystical, in fact, there weren't problems in the management. This province, Augustus was really that hell of a genius. So it's as if Augustus had been simply commanded mentally this knight in leading him towards the right direction by his own faculty, by his own power. Now, the prefect of Egypt was never merely, in fact, a private agent of the Caesars in Egypt either, right? Just as Egypt was never a personal possession of Augustus, right? But it's not something you can simply categorize by saying, okay, so we actually can't exclude, it's simply a secular administrative. No, it's something that goes beyond. It's something that the same senators accepted as they accepted Augustus' divinity, in theory at least. The prefect's headquarters were located, of course, in Alexandria, the ancient capital of the Ptolemaic kings, that had superseded, because of course of the Alexandrian foundation, also the much more important centers of the upper Nile. I mean, upper compared to Alexandria, to the Delta, of course. And here the chancery and all central Roman administrative offices in the Nile province were also situated, because it was also the most populated area, the one which in fact the Macedons had started to rule from as a state. Now the prefect remained in office until his successor arrived. Initially, the prefecture of Egypt was regarded as the highest position available to an equestrian, the pinnacle of equestrian prestige. However, by the Julio-Claudian period, the prefect of Egypt yielded to the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. That's something we'll see in another video better. Whose proximity to the emperor and thus to the heart of power from Rome granted it higher prestige. This tells you how, of course, the Roman state was also compact in a more central direction at that point. Now, the prefecture continued to govern Egypt, though now with primarily civilian responsibilities, even after Diocletian's reforms. Then big leap forward, things had really, in that sense, decentralized to a degree. And we made multiple videos with Diocletian. The reason why these responsibilities were separated is that the emperor had separated the civilian and the military careers in a way that was inconceivable, of course, in Augustan times, because where's the imperium to begin with, and where's the actual of course, it was at that point a much greater bureaucracy, and yes, there is a greater centralization in the manner in which the individual places are ruled, but of course the empire is more decentralized, provincially speaking. So, but let's not philosophize too much. The important is what we see here for Augustus times. And at that point, his jurisdiction would be limited, in fact, to Lower Egypt and the Fayum, while the rest of the country was assigned to Prizes, as they would have called it before, just for what we understand, Latin phonetics having changed over time. So the military organization of Egypt would really set this precedence. Like, for example, Septimius Severus structured Mesopotamia similarly, and would become a precedent for the Saint Gallienus, who removed senators from the army and appointed an equestrian, praefectus legionis, in their place, as we saw before, in a more generalized fashion. So all this was started by Augustus, that, however, was in fact doing so for a specifically contextual balance in his era. Of course, ideally there would have been a greater power held by an individual only that could rule everything, and so Rome had much more of a private, decentralized power was in Augustan times that we imagined that the Roman state was pretty light. The Romans had simply conquered the world through their own manpower and will to simply mold the world in their own image in divine transfiguration. So more modern secular issues would come just later. Right? There is only under Augustus there is a settlement, there is a final stop of the main expansionistic issues, at least in favor of the consolidation of what had been conquered. It's not like during Augustus there weren't other conquests. There were actually pretty big ones, but also pretty big wars. Like there wasn't much of a peaceful reign at this point. But of course the Romans had essentially got them all. In proportion, those conquests didn't bother them too much. There would be other conquests later, but the bulk had been fundamentally systematized by Augustus by this point. It's important to talk about these topics because you may say that what did we talk about today? Because it sounds like, we all know a bit of Roman history from school, from, I don't know, documentaries, whatever, and we assume that, we know historians study things more in depth and whatever, but it's really important to actually look at this. It's not like they're even minor topics. They're actually the same big ones. Today we talk in very big, broad, general terms. Like, that's also what a bit my channel characterizes itself a bit like differently from the others. There are it's not even perspectives, it's not even it's just some dynamics that you must explain when you actually go look at them in the merit, in their meaning. Like why would Augustus simply change the game here? Why would he separate, of course, better? He would define even better, like the partition between the senatorial and the equestrian prerogatives. But he would start with this substitution in command and the control of Egypt just per se, because he just wanted power, or because it was easier to administer. Sure, but why? How did they, and especially with the limits of the time, with the meanings of the time, what did they really mean by that? How did they do it? How would they vie that? Even through their own minds, through their own sense of what Rome really was. This is insane. I mean, that the city could, at this point, yes, it was basically Italy, ruling this the world, essentially, the known world of the time, but truly from a single city that a couple of centuries before hadn't even affirmed itself fully as an international power. And this is the scale by which we're thinking. And until you understand how minded were the Romans in their own specific historical way, you can't really understand it all. You can't really understand Roman history. You can't understand the history of the world. You can't appreciate the becoming of all of this, because you will have had just sort of weird, materialistic, modernistic, secularistic, atheistic view of Rome that has nothing. It's not that it has nothing to do with this. It's that it's diametrical opposite. That's the thing that really people tend to neglect here. That there is no actual way of understanding this without those specific ideologies. And you have been told Roman history only instead through that anti-ideology. And it is, which is an ideology, of course. It's not an ideology is a bad thing. Irish people just reason in the sense they've been trained in thinking that ideology means, even just linguistically, something negative. Study your own languages, study etymologies, study Latin, right? You must understand the language that you speak. We will, of course, it's not the first video that we make about the Augustan era. That's one of those times in themselves containing a universe, more than a universe actually, from which all the rest of history really makes sense and doesn't without, right? For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.